In today's video, I'll show you how to build a tier list maker. This project will teach you JavaScript drag and drop and DOM manipulation while creating a tool to organize items in a tiered structure. Here's what we'll cover. First, we'll start by creating a tier with a simple click on the title. Next, we'll implement drag and drop to easily arrange items on the tier list. To better organize the list, we'll add the ability to move tiers up and down. After that, we'll configure the tier through a settings modal, which will allow us to edit labels and change tier colors. We'll tackle how to delete a tier and return its items to the cards container. We'll also add a feature to clear all items from a tier. Lastly, we'll cover how to add new tier below or above existing ones. If you're new to this channel, don't forget to like and subscribe. Without further ado, let's get started. Let's start by setting up the HTML structure. First, include the bootstrap icon CDN in the head tag. Next, create a container to hold the tiers. Each tier will have the following structure: a label for the tier name, an item section where images will be dropped, and a control section with buttons. Duplicate the tiers to create more. Then, add some placeholder images with different sizes. Now, let's move on to the CSS. Start by setting a universal style for all elements. In the root selector, define the CSS variables that will be used throughout the page. Set the body background color. Center the title and make the text white. Make the image size uniform. Since the images are draggable, set the appropriate cursor. When an image is being dragged, make it almost transparent. Constrain the container's width and add a border around it. Set the background for each tier and use Flexbox to align its content. Apply a bottom border to all tiers except the last one. Prevent the label from shrinking, as seen in the first tier. Next, set its width and minimum height. use Flexbox to center the label content. In the HTML, define a color variable since each tier label will have a different color. Then in CSS, use this variable to set the label's background color. If it's not defined, add a fallback color. Here, make the label editable. Adjust the style so the label is not too big. Then wrap the label content in case it's too long. For the items, use Flexbox for alignment. Wrap the items so they don't exceed the container. Then make it stretch to push the controls to the right. As for the controls, set the width and background as follows. Use grid to center the buttons. Then apply some basic styles to the buttons. Let's use Media Query to enlarge the buttons on wider screens. Back in HTML, remove the images from the tier items. Add a cards container and place the images inside it. In CSS, apply the following styles to the cards container. Next, make the Settings button trigger a modal. In the HTML, add a dialog element for the Settings modal. Wrap the modal content in a section. Then, add an empty container for the colors. Include a text area for the tier label. Finally, add buttons for tier actions. Each button will have its own unique ID. These buttons will allow us to delete, clear, and add rows above or below the current tier. To style the modal, we first need to make it visible. We can use the open attribute, but since we need to style the backdrop, we'll handle it with JavaScript. Here, select the Settings modal and invoke the showModal method. In CSS, center the modal on the page and adjust its default style. For the backdrop, make it partially transparent with a pointer cursor. The section will display content in through columns. The colors and tier label will span both columns. Then apply some basic styles to the tier label and buttons. For the colors, we'll create them dynamically using JavaScript. First, import the color array from a separate file into the main.js file. Next, select the colors container. Create a function to initialize the color options. Inside the function, loop through each color. For each color, create a label element and set the color as its background style. Add a radio input inside the label. Finally, append the label to the colors container. Now, let's style the colors container in CSS. Align the color inputs using Flexbox. Hide the default appearance of the radio inputs. Set the label size and apply the color variable as its background. Then, apply the remaining styles as follows. When the input inside a label is checked, add a before pseudo element. This element will display a check icon to indicate selection. Apply the following styles to align it with its parent label. Next, add multiple box shadows to the checked label for emphasis. With the colors done, let's hide the modal and move on. Back in the HTML, remove all the tier elements. We'll create them dynamically with JavaScript later. In the CSS, apply these styles when the tiers container is empty. Moving on, let's create a tier. First, select the tiers container. Then, write a function to generate the tier element. It will accept a label as parameter. Inside it, create a div with the class tier and structure its content like in the HTML. Return this element at the end. To add a tier, attach a click event listener to the title or the h1 tag. Then in the event handler, call this function and append the new tier to the tiers container. Next, let's make the label and color dynamic. Here, use the number of existing tiers to select a color from the array, so that each tier gets a unique color by cycling through the options. Now, initialize the default tier list with predefined labels. And with that, we've finished creating a tier. Next, let's arrange items on the tier list using drag and drop. First, make the images in the cards container draggable. When an image is grabbed, apply a faded effect using the dragging class from CSS. Then when the image is released, remove the dragging class. Now we're done with the draggables. Next, we'll set up the drop targets, which are the tier items. Here, select the items and attach event listeners for the drag over and drop event. Create the event handlers and log the event to the console for now. When dragging an image over the tier items, the drag over handler works as expected. However, when the image is dropped, the drop handler didn't work. This happens because the tier items are not specified as valid drop targets. To fix this, prevent the browser's default behavior to allow dropping. When dropping an image, the browser might load it or open a new tab. So let's ensure the drop event is handled properly. That's all for handling the drop event. Most of the logic happens during the drag over event. Here, select the dragged image. Next, identify the element under the dragged image. If this element is the items container, simply append the dragged image to it. If you want to place the image between other images, it gets trickier, as the target element will be another image, not the items container. So add a condition to check if the target is an image. Also, the target must not be the dragged image itself. To determine whether to place the dragged image before or after the target, get the distance of the target's midpoint from the left side of the viewport. We can get the target's left position and width through the getBoundingClientRect method. Here, the width of the target element is 75 pixels, and its distance to the left position is 161 pixels. Now, calculate the target's midpoint by adding its left position to half of its width. Next, compare the mouse's horizontal position to the midpoint. If the mouse's position is before the midpoint, prepend the dragged image. Otherwise, append it. Now we can drop an image between other images, allowing us to arrange them on the tier. And that wraps up the drag and drop feature. Next, we'll add functionality to the move up and down buttons. Start by attaching click event listeners to both buttons. Both buttons will use the same event handler. We'll pass the tier and the move direction as parameters. To move a tier up, swap its position with the previous tier. To move it down, swap its position with the next tier. So let's determine the adjacent tier or sibling first. Check if the sibling exists in the case of the first and last tiers. Then determine if the tier should be placed before or after the sibling. Now to test it, rename the B tier and move it up or down. As you can see, the tier moves in the desired direction. And that wraps up moving the tier row. Next, let's work on the settings modal. First, attach a click event listener to the settings button. Invoke the settings click handler and pass the tier as a parameter. Next, ensure the selected tier's label and color appear in the settings modal. Get the tier's label and set it as the text area value in the modal. Use getComputedStyle to retrieve the label's color from its CSS property. Then, select the radio input that matches this color. Now, the settings modal should display the correct label and color for the selected tier. Next, close the modal when the backdrop is clicked. Add a click event listener to the settings modal. Ensure the modal itself triggered the event, not an element inside it. Then, invoke the close method. Now, clicking the backdrop will close the modal. And that concludes the settings modal feature. Next, let's edit the tier color and label. Changes made in the settings modal should immediately reflect on the tier. Here, select the text area in the settings modal and add an input event listener. Then, we need to check the active tier. Fortunately, we already know this from the handle setting click function. To make it accessible outside the function, let's define an active tier variable. Back in the input handler, check if there is an active tier. Select the label inside the tier and assign the text area value to it. Next, we'll handle updating the color. Attach a change event listener to the colors container. Select the label inside the active tier. Then update its CSS color property with the selected input value. With that, the label and color changes in the settings now apply to the tier. Next, let's tackle the last three features together since they are related. First, create the handler for each action and log a message for now. Then, link these handlers to the corresponding action buttons in the settings modal. Here, if the clicked element is not the modal, we know it's an element inside it. We can determine which action button was clicked by checking its ID. Next, define an object that maps each action to its respective handler. Lastly, add a condition to check if the clicked element corresponds to a valid action. If it does, we'll invoke the appropriate handler. And with that, we can move on to implementing each handler. Starting with the delete handler, we first need to check if the active tier exists. If it does, we'll remove the active tier and close the settings modal. Now, when a tier is deleted, it gets removed from the tier list. However, if the tier has images, they get removed as well, which is something we need to fix. Here, create a function that resets the tier images. Select the images from the specified tier. Loop through each one, and append it back to the cards container. Then call this function inside the delete handler. Now that the issue is fixed, we're done with the delete feature. For the clear handler, the logic is almost the same as the delete handler. But instead of removing the tier, we'll just clear its items. That's all for the clear feature. The last feature is quick and straightforward. In the prepend handler, check if the active tier exists as well. Then create a new tier and insert it before the active tier. Don't forget to close the modal afterward. As for the append handler, the logic is similar to the prepend handler, but this time, the new tier is inserted after the active tier. And that concludes adding a row below or above the tier. Before we wrap up, let's implement one last thing. When the settings modal is closed, reset the active tier. And that's it. We've created a tier list maker with features like drag and drop, customizable tiers, and more. If you followed along, you now have a fully functional tool that's ready to use or customize further. Thank you for watching. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more tutorials like this. If you have any questions or suggestions, feel free to leave them in the comments below.